Easter! Let's talk about religious trauma. Hello, my name is Margaret Adele, and welcome to the list of books for girlies with religious trauma. And yes, I put this out on Easter. I brought it up to my Twitter followers that I was trying to put together a list like this, and I asked if it would be petty to put it out on Easter. And everyone said, yes, it would be petty. That's why you should do it. So now we're here. All of the books I am bringing up today, they differ in genre, but they all deal with the harm that religion has caused, specifically Christianity. Obviously, other religions can also cause harm, and I don't want to diminish anyone else that has been harmed by a different religion, but in the modern American cultural zeitgeist that I am enmeshed, it is mostly Christianity that we're talking about when we're talking about religious trauma. Now, obviously, this is a contentious subject, but I will give you a heads up that most of these books aren't as down on the concept as you may think, say for one or two. A lot of them just have really big critiques of the way the entire church is run on a systemic level. We are not talking about specific bad actors or bad apples. This is an issue with long-running methods that the entire church has used across a nation, maybe across the world. I don't know. I am a pastor's daughter, so a lot of these speak to me on a very deep level, but I will try to do my best to bring up all of the various trigger warnings, because a lot of these books do get dark, but be warned, some of these might get, well, again, one or two get very dark, but let's delve into some religious trauma on this wonderful Easter day. The first book is Pray Without Ceasing by Andrew Franks. Like pray, except it's prey, like with an E, like Prey and Predator. I love a good pun. This is a horror novella all about a young boy named Dalton who is a pastor's son and also going to the Christian school that his father's church created, and he's feeling it, and not in a good way. He has this giant crush on a girl at his school, but also is struggling with all of the urges and thinking that makes him a bad person. He has a younger brother that is obsessively praying to such long amounts that he's literally praying through his entire lunch instead of eating it. And there's a lot of struggles in the contemporary narrative side of it, but then there is a horror element to it. I don't want to get too much into it, but essentially plot happens and Dalton, our protagonist, is convinced that he has to spend the night in his father's church to save his younger brother's life, while his church is like overrun with an evil witch and demons and such. And I really liked the demon imagery because it kind of flipped the script. They weren't generic horned demons, because, you know, if you read enough monster erotica, like, that's no longer scary. Instead, in this book, the demons are humanoid looking people that are burnt to a crisp. Like, think like an overcooked hot dog on a grill levels of burnt to a crisp. And for some reason that imagery was a lot scarier to me than if they had been like standard demons. The witch I could take or leave. Again, it's one of those things where like witches have been so sanitized in the modern zeitgeist that it's hard to see them as like evil, but this one can be a harder read. It does deal with domestic and child abuse, and brief but not deep mentions of CP. However, I wish that the book had done a little bit more to really emphasize the realism aspect of the horror, because in the beginning parts of it, it does a little bit too much to make it feel like it's just in Dalton's head. And that's not to say that that makes it, you know, any less scary for Dalton. But as a reader, if I think that this is just someone's mental struggle, I feel pity, I feel sad, but I don't necessarily feel scared unless it really is like drilled down that no, there's a real chance of physical harm here. I will say that the imagery within the church itself, when he is trapped there overnight, is really impactful. And it does do that thing where it's like, did it really happen? Maybe. Like, what does this mean? Like, that kind of thing. And I love the bond between brothers. And again, this one is probably more favorable to religion, or not necessarily to religion, to God as a concept, specifically to the monotheistic kind of God. There is a kind of youth pastor character that steps in to help Dalton when other adults in his life are kind of barreling down because, they're demanding that he cut his hair in school when he doesn't want to, despite the fact that they have, the picture of long-haired Jesus on the wall, and those kind of little, essentially not really pointless rules. And he's struggling with that. And so there are some characters, and in the end, it's not necessarily all religion bad, more so than the system is just corrupt and needs fixing, which that's very optimistic to me. The concept that it just can be fixed and just needs fixing. But this is definitely a horror book for deconstructionists, I would say. And if you're unaware, a deconstructionist is basically someone that is still within the church but is trying to address the systemic problems from the inside. So if that is you, if you are still in the belief system and trying to work to deconstruct your faith and all of that, this would be a good pick for you. If you like horror, there's a lot of gore and, headless deer imagery. So be on the lookout for that. But it is a good pick. And presumably it would also be a good pick for people who just like horror in general, especially when that horror has a good pun. There's actually one that says, one of the chapter titles is "My Cup Holder Overfloweth." Love it. It's so good. Excellent pun. But moving on. On the other end of the genre spectrum, we have Confessions of an Alleged Good Girl by Joya Goffney. This is a YA contemporary all about a teenage girl named Monique who can't have sex. Like, physically, it's not happening, and her boyfriend ends up breaking up with her over it. Great guy, that. But she decides that to win him back, she has to figure out the problem of why it's not working. Just one problem. She's a reverend's daughter and isn't supposed to be interested in sex at all. So she kind of accidentally ends up teaming up with Sasha, the straight-laced good girl that seems to always be better at the Bible stuff than her, and also Reggie, the quote-unquote bad kid that her reverend father is trying to rehabilitate. And they seem to be the only ones that understand that it's okay that she's looking into this medical issue, but this book deals a lot with the kind of trauma that purity culture specifically can bring down and the effects that it can have on your body when you are essentially told to hate your own body and its functions, or to find your own body and its functions inherently dirty and filthy, and the effect that can have. This is also about a dysfunctional family to a certain degree because Monique's older sister left, basically felt too boxed in, and has gone no contact with the family since then. And Monique's left in the lurch. She feels like her older sister abandoned her when she abandoned their parents, and she doesn't know what to do. And she's really, really determined to get boyfriend back. But of course, as it continues on, you're like, pretty sure boyfriend isn't worth getting back. But again, like before, this book isn't the cut everyone off, be done with everything kind of messaging. It's a lot more redemptive. It's a lot more focused on, we need to repair things, we need to fix things, rather than just dumping everything and walking away. I really did connect with Monique to a certain level. Obviously, I did not go to a black gospel church. I went to, well, actually I did for a little bit when I was a kid, but for the most part, the churches my father was pastor of were much different in culture, but some things translate across the cultural boundaries, and that concept of viewing your body as something totally different because of purity culture standards, and then them seeping into your brain to the extent that it affects your entire view of what is a natural biological act, really spoke to me. Monique struggles to even say the words of, penis, vagina, whatever, because they're so taboo to her. And her overcoming that, and not just wanting to jump into sex for the fun of it, but also wanting control over her own body back, essentially. It was really heartwarming. It does have an adorable romance that I loved so much. Loved the characters. They felt very nuanced and well-rounded. Loved the family dynamic in the end. It wasn't, it was a road to get there. But in general, I like this one. There is no on-page sex. I know a lot of people are not into that in a YA novel, especially, and thankfully there's none of that here. It's all fade to black. You know what the problem is, but you never like see it graphically. So if that's an issue, don't worry about it. In general, I really like this one. I know the author has written something else. I believe this is the second YA book they've read, at least, or at least it was the second that I found at my library. So I might have to look into that because it was just an excellently written book. Up next is Exodus 23 by Freydis Moon. I could have picked another piece of work by this author. Heart, Haunt, Havoc also deals with a lot of religious elements, but this one is the most on the nose, as you can see by the fact that it has a biblical verse in the title. But this is all about a trans man named Diego who's kind of been going through it, aside from all of the, arrows that the world slings at you for being queer. He's also just been struggling in general and has recently been bailed out of jail by his mother. So when said mother is like, hey, you're gonna go into the New Mexico desert and help this random dude refurbish this church, he can't really say no. So he goes and finds this enigmatic Brazilian man named Ariel, who is really determined to get this church back up and running, and Diego doesn't understand why, but again, he can't say no. So they start on this construction project, and wouldn't you know it, feelings. But this is not just a romance, it is paranormal romance. Probably you can make the argument that it is monster romance, and I will get into that. But this book delves a lot into the concept of queerness and religion, and is it possible to be a queer person and have any kind of religion? And because both of the characters are Latin, there's a lot of talk about Latin culture and Catholicism. I particularly liked how Ariel went into Brazilian culture versus Mexican culture. That was really fun. But you discover that the outward appearance of Ariel is really just the form he has taken on for himself, because he is one of God's earliest creations, an angel, specifically biblical angel. There's not just wings, okay? There's a lot of other things going on, including eyes. A lot of eyes. Like take the amount of eyes you would already think is probably a little bit too much and add a little more on top of that. That's why I say that this might delve more into monster romance. And I know some people might be off-put by the concept of an angel being termed a monster, but it is very non-human. And there's a lot of discussion on the concept of religion or believing in a higher power versus the hard and fast rules and mores of organized religion, and Diego kind of coming into his own. And the blurb even says this is about queer emancipation as well as delving into religion. There's also talk about immigration, specifically undocumented immigration, and a lot of focus on that. And basically it's a lot of deconstructing. I can speak. So again, if you're interested in that more deconstructing vibe, this one is probably a good pick for you. If you like paranormal romances or monster romances in general, this is probably a good pick for you. You don't get a lot of romances with angels that are biblical, not just a hot person with wings, but like actual biblical angels. I really liked that aspect. And again, this author's work in general deals a lot with religion and stuff. So if you're interested in that, you can always follow them and their work. It's mostly novellas at this point. I am a big fan though. And now we're going to get into a book that Freydis Moon themselves turned me on to. And well, this is the whole reason I made this list in the first place. Lastly, we have Angels Before Men by Rafael Nicolas. This is a magical realism retelling of the fall of Lucifer, and it's super gay. This asks the question, what if Satan was a disaster twink? And once you actually ask that question, you kind of are struck with the, well, obviously, but this is quite literally all about the angel Lucifer during his days in heaven. You kind of watch him being created. Right off the bat, this book is very magical realism-y. Like, it was very hard for me to read at times, not because of all the religious aspects and all the very dark things that happen, but like, I wasn't sure what was a metaphor and what was actually happening like 80% of the time. And the author themselves even joked on Twitter that, like, I don't even know what it means half the time. So, like, I'm glad that I'm not alone in that. But this was a very hard read for me in that way. I've mentioned before that my brain is hyper literal, and this was just 90% poetic language. But this follows Lucifer during his days in heaven, from his creation to his fall. And like I mentioned before, very gay. There's not any like actual, well, for the most part, on page sex. There does come sex later in the story as like a general concept, maybe like a couple of references as part of the downfall. But I didn't think this read as he was thrown out because he's gay. The author does give some warnings that it might appear like that, appear like he was being essentially thrown out of heaven for being queer, but there's such a level of queer platonic relationships going on between all of the angels the entire story that it didn't really feel like that to me. That didn't come across specifically to me. It might come across differently to other people, but moreover, there's some other really dark moments as Lucifer starts questioning things. He is made the most beautiful angel, but he doesn't really want to be, and it embarrasses him at first. And then when he finally starts accepting himself, suddenly it's not okay. And so he's like, well, did you want me to be ashamed of the way you created me? Did you want me to be shy of the way you created me? And yet now when I say, oh no, wait, I am the most beautiful angel, now it's not okay. Like, you can watch as he starts questioning things, but things do get very dark. They get very abusive. There is SA. There is gore in the later aspects, but there was this kind of like level of tension even early on, because, you know, early on it's very happy. It's heaven. And you know it's going to happen because it's a retelling of the fall. So you know eventually we're going to get to that point. And there was like this weird moment of tension for me where I was like, when is it going to start? When is it going to start? And it was also kind of funny because he would make friends with all these angels, and then like some of them would have very recognizable names. Like he'd be like, oh, here's Moloch, here's Baal, and you're like, I know those names. Like you'd hear the names of what we now know today as demons, and you'd be like, I wonder if they're going to side with him or not. And probably the best part of this is his relationship with Michael. Again, it's that kind of weird, they haven't really discovered romantic relationships yet, but that's very clearly what it is. And as Lucifer starts falling more and more away from the status quo, Michael is still, you know, the sword of the Lord, and the angst, the drama and the angst of it. I also like that they go down to Earth, and I think it's supposed to be the time of dinosaurs. I think that's what those creatures are. Again, magical realism, they're referred to in strange ways, but this book does not hold any punches. It is magical realism. It is direct critique of God himself. Like I mentioned before, this is not a deconstructionist story. This is not like, oh, there's some systemic changes, but we can change things. No, this is very much an indictment of the entire concept, and I loved it. And the author did reveal this is actually the beginning of a trilogy. No one knew that, and I know no one knew that because I read the replies on the tweet where they announced that it was a trilogy, and everyone else was like, it's a trilogy? Like, this seems to be a little bit of a book talk darling as well. I've seen it referenced on book talk a lot. But this is definitely, if you don't want deconstruction, if you're like, I'm done, I want to go full petty, I want to go full cut it off, be done, this is probably the book you're gonna like. Again, it's also really queer. Love that for us. And the art that people have made out of this, a lot of people have made like full biblical style art off of this specific book. Beautiful. So it seems to be inspiring a lot of things. But again, very magical realism-y, so if that's not your bag, you might struggle with it. I still enjoyed it. I still liked that I read it, even though I kind of fudged my way through entire sections of the narrative. But in general, this does get very hard. This is a very, very big indictment and critique of the actual deity themselves as opposed to the human systems around it. So be on the lookout for that. The author, thankfully, is up to date on most of their trigger warnings, so I'll definitely make sure to look through those specifically before you get into it. But as far as I can tell, everyone that has decided to read it has been profoundly moved by the experience. So be on the lookout for that one. And that is it. I know this is not a very long list, but whenever I tried to search for books with religious trauma, I just got a lot of like sad contemporaries or like book club style books, and that wasn't what I was going for. I wanted more speculative, more maybe lighthearted, but maybe taking a new spin on things look. So if you know of any more books like that, please let me know. Leave them down in the comments below or tweet at me. I will have my socials in the description. I would love to know more. Obviously, I am a pastor's kid, so this kind of thing interests me, and I would love to get more recommendations in that sphere. And with nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.